is doing well. It's great to have you with us today. We appreciate you joining us. Want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Dupree Mutual Funds. We very much appreciate their sponsoring this activity, making it possible for us to do this every Tuesday and Thursday. We hope you've been enjoying our series. We have a very special program today. Before I get to that, I want to take a moment to note that we have a special event going on today, and that is Giving Tuesday Now. This is an opportunity to donate to Ashland. Nonprofits across the country are doing this. We are a completely private nonprofit. We receive no governmental or other funding. And of course, right now, being closed, our revenues have taken a major hit. So if you choose to do so, we certainly appreciate any and all the support. And you can go to our website, henryclay.org, and donate there at the website for Giving Tuesday Now. So thank you very much in advance. We appreciate that. Today, we have a very special program. Today, I have with me some old friends, David and Jeannie Heidler. We're going to talk to them about compromise and Henry Clay and what that really means, what that aspect of his life is really about. They're well positioned to know that information. David and Jeannie Heidler are the authors of Henry Clay, The Essential American, one of the great biographies of Henry Clay, very readable, very approachable, and very human. And much to my amazement, I looked at the book yesterday, trying to remember when this happened. It's been 10 years since that book came out.
Amazing.
Can't imagine that much time has already passed since that happened. But it's a great book, so I highly recommend it, especially as a great starting point for Henry Clay. They've written a number of other books. They've recently written a book on the rise of George Washington, and they decided to see how the other half lives and wrote a book on Andrew Jackson. They've written books on the Civil War and numerous other American history topics. David was a professor at Colorado State University, Pueblo, and Jeannie was the senior American history professor at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. So thank you for being with us today. We very much appreciate you being here. It's quite a privilege to have you. So thank you for taking the time to share with us this morning. I think to start today, to give our listeners a little background information, why don't you talk a little bit about the United States in the first half of the 19th century, in the era in which Henry Clay was living, and the forces that were shaping the country and that caused him to need to compromise.
Sure. Shall I?
Yes.
Yeah, is rather than those broad arching overviews of the country that kind of get lost in the events that are not necessarily riveting, we found it helpful to do this through the lens of personality. And we happen to have the three personalities here who really overspread the period in Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. Oddly enough, these people are known as the Great Triumvirate, even though they had almost nothing to do with one another, except on occasion. Their careers coincided, and they were all titans in their time. And they're representative of what was happening to the country. Daniel Webster was a New Englander, and early on was a person very interested in promoting the mercantile interest of the region. Calhoun and Clay. Calhoun was a Southerner, South Carolina. Clay was a Westerner in the terminology of the day, from Kentucky, and they were teammates in the push to fight Britain in 1812. But after the war, they began to separate and become representative of something else. Calhoun increasingly becomes a Southern nationalist. Never an overt secessionist, but a Southern nationalist. And Clay, among the three, remains the most consistent. He is an American, first, last, and in between. He represents the burgeoning of the country after the war, with his ideas of internal improvement, stable currency. The problem, as with everything in the country, is that slavery intervenes on the personal relationships as well as the national coherence. The first of these is the Missouri issue in 1820. Then we have slavery rearing its head again under the guise of the tariff dispute in the early 1830s. And finally, a very serious one that almost causes the Civil War 10 years before it happens, when the 1850 crisis breaks, and what Clay himself dubs the 5 bleeding wounds. So these 3 careers are emblematic of the country and what was happening to it. I think anyone who wants to get a sense of the country would do well by reading biographies of these 3 people.
Okay, great. Thank you. I see we have a number of our volunteers tuned in today. I see Diana and Becky and Sue. You will remember Sue, I'm sure. We have at least one of Henry Clay's descendants and a relative of Henry Clay's who's a good friend of the site out in Ohio and a high school teacher. So I'm sure he'll be using this material at some point in his teaching. So great to have everybody today. I see we have Cameron's mother tuned in. See you there, Julie. So we obviously, Clay was known as the great compromiser, and the thing most associated with him is compromise. And he is credited with 3. We can talk about later whether he should be credited with 2 or 3 or more. But what in general did those compromises do across the period of time that he was working?
Okay. Well, the first one, I think the one you're referencing that is a bit iffy is the Missouri Compromise. He's often credited with the Missouri Compromise, but Henry Clay was not the architect of the Missouri Compromise. It was, however, his skill in the House of Representatives that pushed it through. As Speaker, he was peerless in his maneuverings to get things done. So he certainly deserves some credit for the Missouri Compromise. And in some ways, he was the architect of what's sometimes called the Second Missouri Compromise, which was when Missouri passed a constitution that clearly violated the U.S. Constitution. He was able to maneuver things to have Missouri back down somewhat so that they could be admitted as a state. We think that his greatest contribution as a compromiser was over the issue of the tariff and nullification, the so-called Compromise of 1833. I think he, in what he accomplished by bringing John C. Calhoun, who by that time was a personal and political enemy, into the arrangement that he made in 1833, he very likely did avoid a civil war, at least armed conflict in South Carolina over the tariff and nullification. So in that way, and he was truly the architect of that compromise. So I think that is probably where he made his greatest contribution. Now, as for the Compromise of 1850, which is probably the most famous one, I'll let David talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mentioned the 5 bleeding wounds, and there were 5 serious hemorrhages occurring in the country, dealing with the sectional issues consequent to the Mexican cession after the war, the vast amount of territory coming into the Union, whether it was going to be slave or free. Those and ancillary issues were threatening the country to the extent that Clay, although quite ill and quite bitter by this point, because he had been cast aside by the Whig Party in 1848 for the presidential nomination, he came out of retirement, agreed to come back into the Senate. He was quite, as I say, quite ill with tuberculosis and was beginning to show the effects of that, so much so that when he went to see Webster shortly after arriving in Washington, Webster was shocked at what he looked like and how frail he seemed. But when he stood up and gave his famous speech that spanned 2 days in late February of 1850, he wasn't frail. In fact, the old Clay energized himself, spoke in that deep baritone, and called on people to put aside their differences and come together to solve these problems of the 5 bleeding wounds, unless staunched, will hemorrhage the life out of the Union. For 2 days, at the beginning of an effort that lasted all the way into the late spring, early summer, Clay spoke almost 60 times in this effort, and it came within a hair's breadth of getting the thing through. A defection at the very last minute over a technical matter blew the thing up, and he left the Senate in a greater degree of despair than any time of his public life. He was sick and even more embittered, and it was left to others to push the thing through. But this was a remarkable effort on his part, especially because of what it meant. Henry Clay, in his compromise proposals, suggests an abolitionist measure that is in scope not matched until Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. And a lot of people overlook this. It was quite impossible, as Clay discovered, and it was eventually whittled down in the give and take of these negotiations. But it gives us a window on his feelings about this issue, which are quite extraordinary, profoundly humanitarian, and indicate a person who has grown into a belief and attitude about the most shocking problem of confronting the country that was quite forward-looking. One of the reasons I think that Abraham Lincoln was on record as saying that Clay was his beau ideal of a statesman.
Great, thank you. What do you think it was about Henry Clay's personality that made him so capable of engaging in these compromises over the course of his career?
Well, we liked him. we became quite partial to him, and in fact, some people have said too much, that we liked him too much. But we're not altogether uncritical of Mr. Clay. He was a remarkable personality. As a political animal, he was peerless, as he was as speaker, which was why he was peerless as speaker. Henry Clay could meet someone by a punch bowl at a small town social, and 20 years later see them again and ask after their family by name. He was that good. He had a memory for people and a way of connecting with them, whether they were in a conversation solely with him or whether he was talking to a multitude. Every person in the audience felt Clay was talking to him or her personally. And that was something he brought to a negotiating table. In addition to that engaging personality, he was impeccably honest, scrupulous in his arrangements as far as keeping his word. And so people knew that when they sat down and that Clay told them something that was going to happen, that they could bank on it, that there was no question it would happen.
He also was just an extremely likable person. He had that kind of personality that David mentioned that just made people like him, even when they hated him politically. His relationship with Martin Van Buren is a good example. I mean, on opposite sides of the political spectrum, but they were friends. And Van Buren liked him, and he liked Van Buren, who was also a very likable person. But I think that his likability, his kindness, he could be very tender with children and people in distress, that his personality just made people gravitate to him.
You know the anecdote, Eric. It's not true. We wish it were. Of the John Randolph encounter in Washington, when he was walking down the sidewalk, John Randolph came toward him, and Randolph very imperiously stood his ground on the sidewalk and said, "I never step aside for scoundrels." And Clay virtually danced off the sidewalk and said, "I always do."
Yes, indeedy. I love that story. And there are a lot of stories stories about Clay's personality, Clay's magnetism, that I think are really telling. My favorite is about a young legislator who had just arrived in D.C., and you may remember this one. He's new, and a senior legislator takes him to a party where Henry Clay is present, and he says to him, "Do you wish to meet Mr. Clay? I can introduce you." The young man says, "No, I do not wish to submit myself to the fascination of Mr. Clay." What he means is, no, I don't want to go over there because then I'll end up liking him, and then I will have difficulty dealing with him when I get to Congress. So that was the kind of power that he had, and that's a tremendous asset to have when you have to negotiate with a lot of different people.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it definitely helped him a great deal that he had those personal relationships. And you talk about like Martin Van Buren. He visited Ashland, and Clay visited Lindenwold in New York. So, I mean, they were close personal and family friends. So that's a really important tool.
Yeah, they managed to lose the 1844 election
because of their friendship.
Because of their friendship. You know, I mean, that Clay probably would have been elected if he had not agreed with Martin Van Buren that it would be a good idea not to make Texas an issue. So Martin Van Buren didn't get the nomination, and Clay didn't win the election. So.
Right. That's true. One of the things in your book, and speaking with you, that you discuss is the notion that while Henry Clay is known as the great compromiser, that may be somewhat misunderstood, or that there may be more to it than that maybe that's not all that he should be known as. What do you mean by that? Is there something you might call him instead?
Yeah, you know, we've talked about this, the three of us, and we've talked about it with other people. The great compromiser thing we think is way overblown. It's a tag that's convenient. It defines him by three incidents, two in actual fact, of his political career, which spanned a half century. So it's not really very apt. It also gives the impression that Clay was a broker, that he was simply an honest political broker who cut deals when necessary. And that misses the essence of the man, which was an unshakable principle, the central one being the preservation of the Union, that he would never compromise in any shape or form an arrangement that would jeopardize the Union. In fact, everything he did was the exact opposite. So he drew the line on that. It's one of the reasons that he got in such an angry and really very, I think, intensely personal disagreement with John Tyler. Is that he felt John Tyler was essentially misled the American public on his intentions, and that Clay found that to be wrong. And so there was no compromise with Tyler. And it is an indication of how far he would go and how far he wouldn't. And therefore, I think it's probably the better tag what would be Defender of the Union.
Defender of the Union, Savior of the Union.
Yeah.
I like that, and I agree. I think people lose sight of the fact that you're right. It was his uncompromising belief in and desire to defend and protect and grow the Union that really defined his career.
Yeah.
That every time he compromised, it was in view of his unwillingness to compromise on that one principle.
Well, it kind of goes back to what David said earlier. When you put him with Webster and Calhoun, he was, of the three, the most truly American in his principles. He saw himself as a citizen of the United States, not of a section, not of a state. And I think that comes through in his entire political career.
Right. Yes. He always said, first and foremost, I am an American above being a Kentuckian or anything else. So I don't think there's any question that he held that principle perhaps more than most others in his time.
Isn't it interesting, too, that at the end of the day, as they say, when it was all over and Daniel Webster really politically immolated himself on the 7th of March, 1850, he opens that speech by saying, I come to you not today as a New Englander or a Massachusetts, I come to you as an American.
Right.
And that was, I think, Clay's influence in their initial meeting when Webster said he wouldn't support him, but he wouldn't do anything to oppose him. And over the next few weeks of watching Henry Clay, Daniel Webster changed his mind and said, I will support you.
Well, also after hearing Calhoun's words.
Yes, yes.
What do you think, in view of these ideas, is the most important thing that we could learn about compromise from Henry Clay?
Well, I think one of the things that we were talking about is a jovial attitude. That always helps. The more flies with honey maxim comes to mind. The other one is the honesty. I think the idea of a deal once brokered, once negotiated, hammered out, that doesn't really please everybody or anybody, but is it palatable? That can be something digestible and possibly amended if necessary later by mutual agreement. That one of those things is the honesty in coming to that arrangement with assurance of everyone at the table that everyone will keep his word.
Also, never compromise your principles. And that's something he never did.
Yeah, Clay is Jeffersonian in his attitude, but he's Hamiltonian in his application. Because Hamilton's was, before Burr killed him, Hamilton was exasperated with the Federalists because he said, you're stupidly arguing policy as though they were principles. He said, you must separate your principles and your policy and meld the policy to the principle, not the other way around. And that was Clay. Clay believed in melding the policy to the principle rather than the other way around. And he insisted that once you started doing that, the country was in trouble. And he was right, as the 1850s showed.
I agree. I think Henry Clay's principles and maintaining principle, even in the art of compromise, is really, really important. Having that goal drove his compromise and made him a better compromiser in many ways. When you look at having written a book on the life of Henry Clay, obviously you looked across the whole of his life. What do you think maybe is the most important lesson or the most important couple of lessons that you draw from the life of Henry Clay and that would be worth studying that life to learn?
Well, I think one of the things that happens in biography is there's a sense of a great man born to the role. That he emerges from the womb practically destined for greatness, and all of the activities within his life, from childhood into young adulthood, are signposts for that. That you can see. Well, it is the Wing's way of treating Washington, for instance. He's pressed down the cherry tree and can't tell the lie, and there you have the future father of his country as a little boy with his dad, being honest. We avoided that consciously, and as a result saw Clay grow from a person who was a little bit too self-assured, a little bit too smug, a little bit too happy with himself, into someone who bore so much loss personally and bore so many defeats politically that he grew hardened to his distress, but never callous about his relationships. And that is the definition of a great man. And somebody who is destined for greatness to be remembered. That's what we found Clay to teach us, is that the way he matured, even as he was older, not necessarily as a young man, but as he was older. And besides, in that statement, which he very well meant, it wasn't something he said for show, because he said privately, I'd rather be right than be president.
Yes, I agree completely.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting and informative. We have several questions in our chat here. What drew you to learn more about Henry Clay? How did you become interested in Clay, and what drew you to write a biography of Henry Clay?
Well,
We were actually working on a book on the election of 1824, and which of course he plays a very prominent role in. That's where the whole corrupt bargain comes from. And our agent began sort of shopping that around, and talked to this editor at Random House, and he said, "Well, that's all very interesting, but kind of sounds academic." And he said, "Well, why don't you write a biography of Henry Clay?" And we had always admired Clay, found him to be a fascinating, excuse me, I'm pushing my cat away, found him to be a very interesting person, and said, "Well, yeah, we think we would enjoy that." And so that's how we came to write the biography.
I have some recollection of you telling me that, and I'm glad it worked out that way. I think
we are too.
great. We have a question here. This is actually from one of Henry Clay's descendants, so you can frame it and think about it in those terms. He asks, if he and Henry Clay were having bourbon, what would Henry Clay say about Andrew Jackson?
He would probably say the exact same thing to anyone he said to Andrew Healy, the painter, who had just come from the Hermitage when he came to paint Clay in the year that Jackson died. In fact, Healy's portrait is the last Jackson from life. And he had fallen under the influence of Jackson. He was quite a fan by the time he met with Clay. And Clay said, "Well, what did you find so much? Would you call him a sincere man?" And what Clay meant by that was he not just someone who said what he meant, but someone, a man in full, a whole person who was a personality fully formed and in all respects admirable. And sincere, sir, Healy said, "I've never met a more sincere man in my life." And Clay smiled sort of faintly inside and said, "I see that you too have fallen under the fascination of him." So I think that's probably what he would have said.
I don't know if you've been following our Twitter feud with the Hermitage. We've been having lots of fun with that.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. Going back and forth and saying lots of things about one another. So it's been quite enjoyable. You will remember Sue and Wendy Bright. They're both in the audience today. And Ann Hagen Michelle says hi. She's listening.
Hi.
Sue and Wendy both ask about the title. And I know you told me a little bit about the title and how that came about. But the title of the book, how that came to be.
We never titled any of our books except the Washington book. And nobody marketing titles books. And I don't know why they came up with some of the titles they have. We liked the title, but we actually wanted the Western Star, which was what he was known in the early part of his career. But they said that was going to be somebody, we think he was Hoot Gibson or something, and that it was be a Western movie star, Gary Cooper. So they didn't want us to title. So the Essential American seemed to us perfect because it was what we've been talking about in terms of Clay being essentially the American of the period, and also an essential part of its happy accidents and conclusions leading up to the unfortunate things that happened in 1860. And if the war had happened in 1850, if Clay had not been there and the war had happened, the South might have won because the necessary sinews and musculature of the industrial complex in the North, the communications and transportation networks, were not fully formed by 1850. In 1860, the South cannot win the war, the North can lose it only. And so that difference is key to the outcome in 1865. So Clay is influencing elements of the country 10 years after he has passed from the scene.
And that actually anticipates the next question, which comes from a fellow historian named Ron Blair.
We know Ron.
We
a
know
war general who is an ancestor of his. He asked about delaying the war and whether Clay's actions, in fact, did delay the war and whether the conflict was inevitable, but more particularly about the slavery issue and what Clay's views on slavery were and how his views and how his actions relative to slavery impacted the Civil War, which is a huge question. I mean, you could probably do a very lengthy podcast.
We've got to 4 p.m. today. We'll be talking about it this mid
Maybe
afternoon.
break for lunch. Slavery is one of the issues that we struggled with in writing the biography because Clay was a slave owner. He was fairly consistent from his youth to the end of his life in that he saw slavery as a blight, that it was something that was bad for both the slave and the slave owner, that it was something that he wished had never happened. But at the same time, he did own slaves until the day he died. He freed some, but he did retain most of them. His views on slavery, though, as I said, they never really changed. And that, I think, is something that is an interesting facet of his life and not one that you can defend. There's absolutely nothing defensible about it. But in his public life, obviously slavery played a role in all of the so-called compromises, even the nullification controversy. Slavery was an underlying cause of those tensions. But as for Ron's question, did he delay the Civil War? Yeah, I think as David said, he did, not single-handedly, with a lot of help. Was the Civil War inevitable? I'm not sure we can say anything is inevitable. But I believe that slavery could not have been ended without a war, that the two sides were at a point where that just wasn't going to happen. And so that in that sense, I guess you could say that it was somewhat inevitable.
One thing is certain is that if the Union had broken without a Lincoln to press the issue, slavery would not have ended. In other words, for slavery to end, the United States must survive. And if the United States doesn't survive, if it breaks apart, then slavery is going to survive in the regions it exists until other countervailing forces eliminate it. And that could have happened, as in the Spanish instance, 20 years on, or much farther down the road with maybe very violent sort of Haitian overtones to it. In other words, the Union was the surest way to eliminate slavery. And that was one of the reasons that he found the Union to be sacrosanct. If the Union broke, then all manner of evils would occur or be perpetuated.
We have another question from our business manager, Kate Heil, who is watching from home. She asks, what surprised you in your research about Clay? What did you learn that you perhaps weren't expecting to learn or didn't know, or that you found most surprising about Henry Clay when you did the book?
Well, I don't think we really knew anything about his family life before we started the book, because that's just not something that you study in history classes or read in regular books. And I found his family life to be absolutely fascinating. It surprised me how warm and loving a father he was and husband, that his family, obviously not always a happy family. There were lots of tragedies in the family, but I found his family life and his relationships with his family and his extended family to be fascinating. And that's one of the things that I think I'm the most proud of in the book, is that I think we brought the personal side of Henry Clay to life in a way that other biographies had never done before. What surprised you?
Well, that I think I was surprised at the depth of feeling that Clay had for his children, um, and that I think he was a tragic figure because the children either let him down or they died, and all the girls died, and and the boys could be, as you know, a very mixed bag. Having to send checks to Philadelphia to get them out of the drunk tank is not a way that a statesman wants his world to spin. And that happened. Or having one, hold his putative sweetheart's family at gunpoint. Those are kinds of incidents that can keep anybody up at night. And I'm afraid Mr. Clay had a lot of sleepless nights over that.
Yeah, I think a lot of parents would enjoy those parts of the book.
Or at least sympathize
Yes,
with them.
and really sympathize.
Another of the issues, Clay was interesting that he was a proto-abolitionist when he was young. I think that was George Wyth's influence. And his idea of trying to abolish slavery in Kentucky before it got too firmly entrenched on the ground was one of the great missed opportunities of the state's history, the region's history, as well as Mr. Clay's career.
But he was too young.
He was too young.
And,
he didn't have the support.
Yeah, didn't have the backing.
And then later, he bookends that with the Pendel letter, where he essentially ends his political career by criticizing slavery to the extent that nobody in the North believed him and nobody in the South trusted him after that.
I have to agree with you about the personal side. I think many of the biographies that preceded yours did short shrift to the personal side of Henry Clay, and they want to blame him for a lot of the things you're talking about, the problems with his sons and that sort of thing. And that's not really fair. It's not appropriate to say he was a bad father because he was not.
No.
He certainly had some bad habits, and he knew that, and he told his sons that. But I think it's very unfair to characterize him that way. And I think if you don't appreciate what he went through as a father, it makes it more difficult to fully appreciate what he was doing as a political figure. When he comes to Washington to do and engages in the activities that result in the Compromise of 1850, he does that as a sick man, having lost all 6 daughters and then his namesake son in a war he adamantly opposed. That would have been tough for anyone to do. There are very few people who would have done that, and yet he did. And that tells you a lot about how he felt about his country. He was willing, after all of that, to get up out of his chair, leave his home, and go back to D.C. And I think your book does that better, really captures the human side of Henry Clay better than most. It's one of the things I've really appreciated about the book. Our executive director, Jim Clark, says thank you very, very much and contributing to our understanding of Henry Clay and Ashland history. I certainly want to thank you for being here today. This has been great fun. It's great to see you again. It's always nice to catch up every so often. And if you're in the area, please stop by.
We will.
Thank you so very much for being part of our program today. For those of you out there watching again, today is Giving Tuesday now, so please visit the website. If you would like the Heidler book, you can get it from the museum store. I'm going to try to show it in the window. We'll see how this works here. Oh, 3 windows. Check it out. There's the book. So you can get that at the store. Go to our website. You can order it. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. A lot of great stuff there. A lot of it for the first time. So thank you very, very much. It's great to see you again.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much. This has been fun.
Glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.